Today's guest is a definition of resilience, Dr. Elin Haf Davies, former Wales A rugby international, paediatric nurse, neuroscientist, ocean rower, sailor and founder of Apparito, a health tech company acquired by Eli Lilly. She's the first woman to row the Atlantic, deciding to take on the world's toughest rowing race, having never been to sea and never even picked up an oar. That decision alone speaks volumes about her determination and strength and character. From there, she was part of the first all-female crew to row the Indian Ocean, sailed the Pacific in Force 11 gales, and crossed the Atlantic again in the famous RORC Transatlantic race, and completed 5 of the famous Rolex Fastnet races, racing over nearly £300,000 for charity along the way. She's carried the Olympic torch, led high-performing teams, and built a company that caught the attention and was acquired by a global healthcare giant. Her story isn't just about adventure, it's about what those experiences teach us about leadership, teamwork, and performance under pressure. Ellen, welcome to The Business End.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome, Ellen. Ellen, you didn't grow up near an ocean and you'd never rowed before, and yet you took on the Atlantic. Where does that drive to take on challenges most people wouldn't even dream of come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, I grew up in rural Wales, daughter of a farmer. And I think just being in that environment, being on the farm, just leads to a natural appetite for adventure. And I actually think that sort of appetite for adventure was in me very young. I left home at 16 and went to live in Lesotho in Africa at 18 to work for Save the Children. Wow. So I think the appetite for adventure was always there. It just obviously grew and grew as I got older.
Wow. And what sparked that? But where did the idea to row the Atlantic, where did that come from?
Well, I was going through a bit of a difficult time in my life. So I was going through a divorce. And at the time, I was also part of the Welsh women's squad. I'd sort of had 13 A caps, but never got that sort of infamous full cap. I was the non-travelling reserve for the World Cup, which, as we know, is the most pointless position to be in the world when you sort of sat at home twiddling your thumb, sort of wishing your teammates get injured, but obviously not really wanting them to get injured. And then I got dropped from the squad fully. So I'd lost the identity of being in the Welsh squad. I was going through a divorce. And some would say it was a bit of a midlife crisis. But yeah, it was my therapy to find myself after all that, I think.
And what exciting therapy.
Yes, it was. Certainly became a life-changing experience.
Now, let's talk about leadership. The Atlantic taught you commitment and finishing what you start. And the Indian Ocean taught you to adapt when the goalposts move. The Pacific reinforced the importance of trusting your crew. Which of these lessons has had the biggest impact on your life and on how you lead and your career?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because when you split the 3 oceans that way, it actually reflects the journey of Apparito, the company I founded. So, you know, in the early days when I started the Atlantic and started Apparito, it was very much naivety. You know, I did not have a clue what I was letting myself in for, but I jumped in feet fast. And then sort of once you're committed, you kind of go, well, I've started now, I have to finish this. And that was true for, you know, the Atlantic and starting Apparito, that, oh my God, what have I done? But I'm here now, so I need to find a way through it. And then, you know, with Apparito, you then go through more of a sort of not quite scale up, but things are kind of happening and you just have to push through and kind of carry on. And then at the latter part of Apparito, before we were acquired, it was then around making sure you had team members that you could trust to do everything on your behalf, so that the identity of me as the founder and Apparito didn't sort of become, you know, synonymous, and that I could demonstrate that there were other team players that could be probably towards the end even more capable and competent of doing those things on my behalf. So it's sort of, I think the company transitioned through those different parts in the same way the different ocean crossings did in some way.
Interesting. In business, leaders often face storms they can't control: market shifts, competition, economic headwinds. How do you decide when to push through and when to adjust course?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because, again, I think you can learn a lot from good seamanship, and you know, you sort of look at the vessel you've got and the storm that's coming in, right? So if you're in a dinghy and you've got a hurricane coming in versus if you're in a cargo ship and you've got a little tropical storm coming in, you sort of plan accordingly. And, you know, if the storm coming your way is just, you know, it would be foolish or not seamanship of you to just think you're going to plow on, then you have to, you know, go into harbour or, you know, batten down the hatches. Whereas if you think actually this storm is, you know, the boat's well prepped, we're safe, the crew's happy, let's just plow on. And I think it's having to make those calls all the time. You know, in the early days, obviously Aparito was a mere dinghy. I'm not saying it ever got to sort of cargo ship status, but it became, you know, a bigger, stronger vessel that we were able to then, you know, sort of decide to plow on through this storm because we knew it would pass, versus, you know, actually, and interesting, I guess the biggest storm that we came across was COVID. And that was very much where we said, this is the storm that we can hold course because we've got what it needs to plow on through here.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, and Ellen, we've got a mutual friend in the great sailor Ian Walker, a guy who won the Ocean Volvo around the world race. He's an Olympic gold medalist. I can remember that we both did an event where he spoke, and he talked about when you're in the middle of the ocean, if a crew isn't doing their job, you can't do anything about it, and you can't like literally dismiss them in the middle of the sea. And the importance of hiring the right people from the outset to achieve your missions. Has that message from the likes of Ian Walker shaped how you in business hired your teams to build the success you did with your company?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the process of hiring, and, you know, let's be honest, I definitely did a lot of mistakes in the hiring over the 10 years and probably would be the one part that I said you know, that caused the most amount of challenges in building Aparito was sort of the hiring part. But, you know, looking back and learning what did work well, and again, much like taking, you know, a crew out to sea, you need to make sure they're trained well. You wouldn't take, you know, a sailor to the middle of the Pacific who hadn't had the experience and the training to do it. And you also need to make sure they've got the right equipment, right? They can't do their role well in the middle of the Pacific if they haven't got the right gear and the right equipment, the right weather information. And it's a bit the same of what you can expect from your crew or your team in the company. You know, have they had enough training and support to do what you're expecting to do them at that point? And are you giving them the equipment that they need to do that? Yes, I appreciate, you know, you're not going to throw anybody overboard in the middle of the Pacific for not performing, but actually the same disruption, certainly in a startup or a small company, you can't just hire and fire at a whim because the disruption is a lot. But I think there is one key element in business that applies more is, if you're already thinking that somebody should go, you're already too late. It needs to be acted. And I think the biggest mistake I did was knowing that somebody wasn't either performing or fitting well in the team, and then thinking, oh, but I'll give them a chance, I'll give them a bit more time. And then that bad apple in the cart just has untold damage on the rest of the crew.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things on that business can learn from sport. Number one is we had Willie Anderson on the show, and he talked about bringing a team that you trust from the outset. In my business recruitment, we're always trying to get the best people from the start, so that you mitigate the risk of that type of thing happening. The second thing is basically giving people, as you say, the tools really to perform. And if Willie had a 3W strategy, which he talked about, and there were people that if they weren't fitting the culture and what was expected of them, you got to find out why and set down the tough boundaries. Sometimes that could be you as a leader, but sometimes it could just be the individual. And at that point, I think you just got to make the boundaries very clear. And as you say, sometimes you've got to cut to move forward to protect what you're doing.
Yeah. And it's hard. I think that was by far, you know, the dynamic of those difficult conversations was probably something I never mastered well enough in the early days. Just having those difficult conversations far earlier and far more frequently.
Yeah, as a startup, they're kind of like your friends, your family. And it's very, very difficult. I know that from my own experience of having those tough conversations.
And as a startup, rightly or wrongly, I thought this is just me and my mad idea. I'll be lucky if anybody wants to work with me. And so it was a mindset of, oh, well, somebody wants to work with me, that's amazing. I'll just go with it, regardless of thinking, actually, this is my idea, it's going to be amazing. And you're lucky to get the opportunity to sort of work with me.
Little did they know, Ellen, little did they know.
So when you're analysing a potential bad apple, are you going with your gut? Are you analysing performance? How are you coming to that conclusion? How did you approach that problem?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we should listen to our gut more. I think I would have said something in my gut told me it wasn't working way before the data of performance or other data-driven things told me. Mm-hmm. And I think as human interactions, we can pick up on those social cues of why they do or don't work. And I just wish I'd listened to those earlier and not wait till the data was punching us in the face with the obvious, really.
Fair enough. So rowing 12 hours a day in 4-hour shifts must have been very challenging. How did you maintain focus and energy in long, high-pressured situations? And how can business leaders apply that discipline in their own teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think, essentially very different to sort of river rowing or sort of Olympics distance rowing. The Atlantic or the Indian, they're marathons, not sprint. And, you could turn that statement around and say, oh my God, Ellen, you were sleeping for 12 hours a day. That must have been a cruise kind of thing. And I think that's in some way, making sure that you do have equal part rest, recovery and performance when you are on that high performance journey that's more than just a sprint. Apparito was, I guess, well over a decade, probably close to 11 years. And there's no way that you could sustain, a 10-year sprint pace journey, really. I'm not saying, again, there was definitely times toward the end that I was close to burnout. And I know people do use that word sort of quite frequently now, but my batteries was so empty towards the end. And I think kind of understanding when you do need to look after yourself. So I think that the balance, I sort of, the line between self-preservation and selfish can seem quite thin, but actually if you can't sort of preserve yourself, then, we couldn't maintain a safe boat. I couldn't maintain the growth of the company. So sometimes I think this sort of, entrepreneurship must be 24/7, 365 days a year mentality is actually not healthy, and appreciating rest and recovery. And actually that's where time to think and get new ideas and reflect is important. So yeah, it's not all go.
No, that's a very, very powerful lesson to learn, I think, as founders or co-founders of entrepreneurial or leading teams in business. You can't sprint all the time. You have to take time to have your deep work, to recover, to have balance in your life, or you do burn out, and I think that's something that we learn as athletes, because there's different seasons in the week and in the day in terms of what you're doing as you prepare for games, pre-season, in-season, competition phases, etc. So that's
And if you think of those sort of athletes, marathon runners who are, in a tapering phase for a big event, they never feel guilty they're in a tapering phase.
No.
They just know that's what's required for them to peak at that time. But if you speak to an entrepreneur and they go, oh, I'm just in a bit of a downtime at the moment, I'm taking time out to think, people are like,
no, yeah.
I'll do that. So it's
so important. You have to go back or calm down sometimes so that you can go forward with strength. And if you can't lead yourself, you can't lead anybody else. So incredibly important lesson.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys are talking about this, because it's great, because there's sometimes where things really matter, and that's where the business end comes into it, and that's where you got to focus on things. It's about spreading your time. So in terms, let's go back to elite performance again, Ellen, because from a business and a sporting level, I mean, what daily habits or rituals do you undertake to perform really a peak performance? They say, small margins win things. And I imagine that's true in sailing as well as business for you.
I probably shouldn't admit having a glass of wine with every meal, or a glass of wine too many at the weekend. It's an interesting one. I have been thinking about this, and if I'm being honest, I can't say that I probably have managed to tick that box in my personal life, but I would just say that it's just consistently trying, just turning back up and keep trying is probably what worked for me. Not necessarily, I don't know, saying that I really reached that margin of perfection the whole time. It's just that I rocked back up the next day and the day after and tried again.
Well, as they say, Ellen, more is better than perfect, and you've achieved a lot in business. So you're probably being a bit kind of humble for yourself, really. But let me perhaps reframe that, okay? As a business leader, how do you stay in the zone so you distract noise, so you're fully 100% on the business? I appreciate not all the time, but when it matters, how do you do that?
I mean, for me, it was very much around what was my North Star or what was my mission. And, maybe, goes back quite a bit, but I founded the business because of the clinical and patient need I'd identified, not because I wanted to start a business. And I think for me, if I hadn't got that real strong sense of vision and mission of what I wanted to do, that sort of North Star that always brought me back to what I wanted it. If it was just around building a business, that was, I'm not saying that, selling car tires is not important or other things, but it wouldn't have been enough to get me out of bed trying. So it was finding that mission that got me excited and out of bed and driven to work for it every day was what worked for me.
Yeah, it's finding the passion and the purpose, which is such an important message.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you said everyone has their own personal ocean to cross. You face storms at sea, setbacks in sport, challenges in business. How has sport prepared you to turn adversity into opportunity?
I mean, sport has played such an important part of my life, and I can't emphasize that enough. From rugby to rowing to sailing, it has literally sort of molded me in part to who I am today. Part of that was sort of teamwork. I've said this so many times, people put it, but rugby to me is an illustration of life, right? It doesn't matter what size or shape you are, what skill you have, there's a position for you on the pitch, from your prop to your scrum half to your winger, completely different skill set, but there's a role and a value add that they contribute to the match. And that's the same in a team, in business or in society, right? And I think that sort of appreciating that this team will only function if I respect and admire the fat prop that I was and the skinny gobby scrum half and the fast winger in equal measures. And that's the same in teamwork and society. And that's really important. The one thing I would say that I've struggled the most with going from sport to business, that in sport you have very clearly defined rules and you have very clearly defined ways of regulating those rules with the referees or umpires or whatever. And then sports, athletes follow those rules because they know, by and far, I mean, yes, we have extreme scenarios where athletes don't follow the rules, but on the whole, you just have that pride that you want to be following those rules. In business, that doesn't exist. And I really struggled when it came to negotiating business contracts, building, kind of collaboration. Not everybody has that sense of following the rules, understanding the rules, interpreting the rules in the same way. And I think that's where business probably misses out on more of the behavior side of how people rock up to perform as a result.
I think you've raised two valuable, very valuable points there in terms of all shapes and sizes on the rugby pitch and all contributing and finding their lane to aid to the success of the broader team and then having that sort of North Star. We're in sort of guide rails within the laws of rugby, and as you say, it's a little bit looser or how people operate, or how they see things in business, and having that guiding light of how you as a business leader will conduct yourself and deal with challenges and collaborations with other people is very, very important.
Yeah, I think it's about, you find after a while you find your own kind of rules, Ellen, when you're in business, don't you? And you find your own routines and your own way of doing things, and that kind of consistency I found helped me over time. I said the problem is though when you get people moving out of their lane a little bit, when you got a prop that's trying to play on the wing.
Well, I'll have you know.
I'm not referring to you, Ellen.
Those wingers loved it when I was standing in their way.
We've got a few stories about that, London Irish, but you know, and putting people in different positions. But yeah, that's when the challenges come in. But on a more serious note, now you talk. I mean, you're an inspirational figure. You're probably too humble to admit that, but you are. And you talk a lot you talk a lot about every person has got their own ocean to cross. Now that ocean for you was like picking up a pair of rowing oars and deciding to cross the Atlantic Ocean, having never rowed before. And other people, their ocean could be, they could, you know, could be suffering with illness, could literally just, or depression, could be just getting out of bed and starting their day in the morning. That could be their Atlantic Ocean. What would be your key tips for overcoming adversity and overcoming life's challenges, whether that's life, business, or sport?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me, it's find your tribe is one thing. And your tribe could be your family, but actually sometimes not everybody has a family that actually supports them in those things. I was lucky that my friends and family, you know, were also ones that became my biggest cheerleaders, from ocean crossings to rugby to, you know, setting up a company. But having like-minded people, and I don't mean like-minded people in terms of they just say the same thing as you all the time, but they buy into what you're doing and why you're doing it and become, you know, a constant level of support. I think that's really important, because all of this essentially requires, you know, wider people that support you, and also who, let's be honest, sacrifice, right? Because you're often at a birthday party and you're constantly looking at your phone because there's a big email about work that's kind of needs to drop in and take your attention, and yet they still support you through that, even though you're a bit distracted at those times. Or, you know, those weddings I missed because I was in the middle of the ocean, and they still kind of invite you to ongoing things. So finding your tribe is really important. And then I appreciate it's easier said than done, but more around comparing yourself to where you were yesterday as opposed to comparing yourself to other people, because everybody, again, you know, we're not all in the same storm, because some of us are in different vessels, right? And so you can only really honestly compare yourself to who you were yesterday and strive to be better tomorrow.
Yeah, it's using your community, your network to give you support. And number two, very important point of what you said is like celebrating almost small steps rather than like I've got to get from A to Z. It's getting to A to B, which is very important in adverse situations, I think.
Yeah, I always used to say, you know, I could never focus on, you know, the whole day or the whole shift when I was rowing. It was like just one stroke at a time. So breaking it down into small pieces is also much easier than trying to kind of take on everything in its whole, you know, total. Otherwise it gets overwhelming.
Yeah, it takes the pressure off yourself, and that's the same in sport. Basically, if you concentrate on the result, you're never going to get it. But if you concentrate on the small steps every time that make up the result, you'll get the result 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, Ellen, we're into the rapid fire questions here, so don't overthink it, and let's get into it. Biggest lesson sport taught you?
Perseverance, I think. Just keep on going.
One leadership trait you value above all?
Honesty.
Hardest moment in your business journey?
Facing near bankruptcy in Apparito and having to regroup and bounce back from that. I think that's pretty much the lowest.
Was that in COVID, Ellen?
No, pre-COVID. I mean, ironically for us, COVID sounds a bit wrong, but COVID was good for business, right? Because we had the tools ready to go. But at the time, the cultural belief was that patients couldn't be cared for in their own home in that way, and then COVID forced it. But it was, a good couple of years before COVID. We had a tech team that was far too expensive for what they really delivering. We couldn't get investment in. Winning new business contracts was taking too slow, so we had to downsize and regroup, and that was really a tough.
So can I just ask one quick fire question, Fitz, on this? Because I think it's a very important point about for people that are in business facing situations, particularly startups. What would be your top tips basically for when you're facing cash flow issues or facing issues with your business?
Yeah, it's really difficult question to answer because every situation's ever so slightly different. And I think in a startup scenario, you're always a minute away from bust or boom, and you just don't know which one will be because you just don't have the depth of finances to, cope with any unexpected challenges or costs. And you never know when that big contract's going to last. So you're literally on this thin, line of, bust or boom in a nanosecond away. And that can be exhausting for sure. I think for me, having support around you for people that really understand the financial kind of decisions that has to be made if you're downsizing. And I know, there's a huge focus now on blitzing and scaling. I'm not convinced I know it may work for the sort of 1% of companies, but most other companies can't grow at that scale without increasing that risk of bust kind of even more. But maybe that's slightly the more conservative side of me that's sort of speaking on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. Good answer.
Proudest career moment?
Do you know, I actually think it's my PhD. I was an absolute delinquent at school. I never really got on well with teachers. I guess I was just too chatty and not concentrating. But also I didn't learn in the way that school expected you to learn, was just to, listen and memorize and regurgitate in exams. So school and I never got on. But as soon as I got into nursing and research and things I loved, all of a sudden I found sort of, I guess, academia and the way we sort of define it just more exciting. And when I graduated from my PhD, in a very slightly mean way, I imagined my science teachers and all those that kind of pretty much told me I would never amount to anything because I couldn't listen and memorize in class.
Good for you. Ellen, your career proves that traits forged in sport and adventure, resilience, commitment, adaptability, and trust are exactly the ones that leaders need to succeed in business. From the rugby pitch to the world's toughest oceans to building a company that caught the attention of a healthcare giant, you've shown what's possible when you lead with purpose. Thank you for joining us on The Business End.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Ellen.